Welcome, everybody. So nice to see how successful and how many people attract those webinars. Today we have Chris Hunt. And Chris, probably you know him in person or from publications. He works at USDA, which is the FPL, the Forest Products Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin, US. And we all know him working so many years now on soy protein systems with other colleagues there and collaborating closely with the industry in that area. Especially, um, we know Chris from his work on the structure of different proteins, and that has helped a lot to understand how structure is related with the performance. And that creates possibilities, of course, to further improve those systems. I don't want to say a lot, so we have the opportunity the next 45 minutes, I guess, to know latest developments by Chris. And Chris, you have the word.
Yes, so thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for taking your valuable time to come and listen to this. I hope you find it worthwhile. Please feel free to reach out. I love to continue the conversation afterwards. The Forest Products Laboratory, our job is to increase knowledge and to help industry make better products. So I'm not selling anything. I'm just pursuing understanding and trying to help you. And in this, I would love to acknowledge Charles Frihart, who had a big hand in developing these ideas. And so thank you, Chuck. Chuck retired a couple years ago, but still is active. So my talk is going to focus on plant proteins, especially the proteins that come from seeds. Most of our work has been done with soy, but I think that there's a lot of transferability. A lot of that information is relevant to canola and other proteins, more or less. So just recognize that I'm soy-centric. Okay, so plywood was originally all bonded with protein, soy protein, blood protein. These were later displaced by petrochemicals, but with formaldehyde regulations in North America, a major producer of hardwood plywood converted to soy back in 2006, 2007. And so since that time, soy is the dominant adhesive system for interior plywood in North America, about 17,000 tons a year. The European standards are different from the North American standards, and they're more challenging for soy or for protein-based adhesives, so we don't have as much traction in the European market as the North American. There's about a paper a day comes out on protein adhesives and wood products. So there's thousands, literally, of recipes for particle board, fiber board adhesives using protein, but very little commercial use. Now, I must say that you can mix in on the order of 20% flour with PMDI, and it helps the distribution and tack and things like that, and you still get exterior properties. So there is that application, but as far as using the protein as the major adhesive component, interior plywood in North America is the only market where it really has strong traction. Animal proteins can be very different from plant proteins, and so I just want to make that distinction that I'm focused on plants here. So I'm going to cover 3 topics in today's talk. What is the physical form of plant storage proteins, native or denatured, when they're delivered in a water-based system? Second question is, how do proteins associate and form the film? Water, other denaturants, water is a denaturant of proteins, temperature, are very important in that, so that's going to be a big part of that discussion. And then finally, what can we do to improve the wet strength? What are some possibilities? So, the physical form of proteins as they're delivered. First, we start out on the left here with this is the native state of one of the dominant proteins in soy. And this is very common for seed proteins to be very globular, like very compact, semi-spherical, with a wide variety of chemical functionalities on the surface, varying from hydrophobic, which would be green, hydrophilic, red. So a very diverse surface and very compact. And you can see about 9 nanometers is the size of this one. So they're compact, generally globular, with all these functionalities: carboxyl, amino, sulfur, hydroxyl, phenolic, aromatic. This wide functionality, especially the hydrophobic stuff, tends to make these things stick to each other when they're dispersed in water. And that leads to viscosity. So if you had a surface that was all hydrophilic, like some proteins, you could get very high solids and low viscosity, but that's not what most of these plant proteins are. So this nonpolar surface leads to viscosity issues, but I also believe that nonpolar surface gives you wet strength in the cured state. So we'll talk more about that later. So, and polar draws water in, and polar bonds are weakened by water, so we don't want these polar interactions to dominate the adhesive. Wet strength is a big issue with these. These proteins have a lot of hydrophilic residues, and so you get a lot of water, and the swelling that we've been measuring is like on the order of 100%. So double their thickness when they get swollen with water. Not great for wet strength. When you look at the literature, there are two main sources or two main ways that people use proteins: either isolated proteins or as a flour. Protein isolation is expensive. And in the wood products industry, we're competing with urea formaldehyde. In interior products, there's nothing cheaper than urea formaldehyde. So in commercial application, flour is the practical solution, just because even flour is a little more expensive than urea formaldehyde in many cases. You just can't afford the isolation. So flour contains 30 to 60% protein, depending on whether it's from corn or soybean or whatever your source is, and the balance being mostly carbohydrates. Not very often oil, because oil is high value in a lot of these are seed crops, so the oil is the main product that's taken out first. Because they come out of living systems, there's a huge variety of proteins that you can't afford to do the isolation, so you get all these various different proteins. Another thing about working with proteins is that they're really big polymers. And because they're such big polymers, kinetics very much limits their reorientation, and they're very sticky also. So because of that, they do not go to their thermodynamic minimum in any reasonable time frame under most conditions, and therefore their history matters. You take your urea formaldehyde, and it doesn't matter if it was 60 degrees a half an hour ago and you cooled it down, or whatever. Its history doesn't matter as far as the conformation of the molecule. But with these large molecules, it's big. So history matters. And therefore, in papers, I always look for what exact grade and style of protein did you get? What was the processing history of that protein? Because it'll affect your results. Commercial formulas rely on added cross-linking agents. That's just where the industry is. Why soy? As I said, I'm soy-centric. It's renewable, bio-based content. There seems to be a lot of interest in bio-based content in the industry. No formaldehyde. It's a co-product of oil production, as is canola flour. In the US, it's $1 a kilo, high protein. The volumes are amazing. 370 million tons a year grown around the world. The entire interior wood adhesives market is somewhere in the 15 million tons a year. So it's quite small relative to the volume available. And the soybean farmers are organized and fund this. So that's another reason why soy is funded. Also, I didn't mention this, but it has commercial use. And so the commercial companies are also funding this program. Soy's weakness, and I should have changed this to protein adhesives, is generally water. We'd love to get better wet strength at a reasonable, at low cost. We want more wood failure and less delamination in plywood. Wet cohesive strength, and especially for particle board and fiberboard, I believe wet stiffness would be useful. So water is what we focus on. Something that's very highly repeated in the literature and borne out by data is that denatured proteins generally bond somewhat better. And so there's a general desire to denature the proteins before you use them. What does this mean? What do they look like? So here's the native state of one of the soy proteins, just as an example of a protein. And this is pictures I've drawn from the literature of what the cured adhesive looks like. I pulled these out because I disagree with these pictures. I think there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that we are drawing proteins in many cases. Just going to give you a second to look at them and think about what you think it might be. And then I will say that the proteins are very hydrophobic in general. There's a lot of hydrophobic residues. It costs a lot of energy to open up and extend, like spaghetti. And so while during denaturation they can extend, there is a lot of driving force to push them back, and there's a bunch more to that. But the extended state I have a problem with. I think the proteins are actually in the coiled up short, they're still a ball, not extended like shown in those pictures, because they don't stay extended in many cases. They pop open and in milliseconds are closed back up again through hydrophobic collapse. So here's molecular dynamics of various different states of proteins and various levels of disorder. But these extended states are typically transient. There's still a lot of hydrophobic residues, and so they may pop open like this for milliseconds, but then they close, they fall together again and compact again because of that. Another thing is that when these things are applied to wood and actually hit the press, the solids is 50% or more. And you think about 50% solids with a bunch of balls, there is not space to do. You cannot do this when you're at 50% solids or higher. There's just no room. So, these are the conditions that I believe that the proteins are in, when you're denaturing them in the press. And then I'm just throwing in a photo of a protein gel. You see balls of proteins. So there's millions of molecules in any one of these little balls. But I think that ball picture is the one that we should have in our heads. The reason this is important, the fact that the proteins are in structures like this, is because that means that most of the interactions between protein subunits are intramolecular, as in they're talking to themselves. Whereas we're used to, in the polymer world, seeing extended structures where we have lots of intermolecular. So there's a shortage of interactions between the protein and its neighbor because of this feature. Now, there's a whole bunch of arguments about why we think that the denatured state is collapsed in most cases in these adhesive systems. as opposed to the spaghetti that's talked about or imaged in the literature. And it's great. This is on YouTube because you can go back and look up these references and do all that. But there's a lot of, oh yeah, this is now published. Look up Charles Frihart, Soy Protein Structures and Performance Properties, and it talks more about this. So denatured, yes. Extended, no. Think of rice, like, you know, the proteins running into each other like this, or maybe being compacted like that, but probably more like this. Rice, not spaghetti. And these are the implications in how we think about adhesives. So we really need to connect proteins to their neighbors to develop the cohesive strength of the film, the glue line, because that's where we're seeing a lot of failures in the wet state. The cohesive strength of the adhesive film is limited by the interactions between neighboring proteins. And if we had good polymer entanglement, that would not be the case. Polymer entanglement is a great way to develop strength within a film, and I think we have very little of that. It also means that these protein-protein interactions that are developed via processing, via prior denaturation treatments or various processing things, can impact the bond performance, because if those interactions persist through the bonding process. So you can develop interactions, then place the interacting proteins in the adhesive, and those can carry through. Another implication of this model as opposed to this model is that you have very limited availability of most of the amino acids. Most of the amino acids are buried inside, and so you only have access to the surface. It also means that by refolding the protein, by denaturation treatments, by rearranging this into a different ball, you can have different surfaces, or a preponderance of one thing or another on the surface. And that can have an impact on performance. Okay, let's go into part 2. How do the proteins associate with each other during the bond formation? Okay, I'm going to do this one live instead of the video. This is a protein. We'll put it in the middle there. Whoa, and it's pretty obvious that it's brittle, both by the sound and by the fact that it just cracked on me, and it's raining outside, so it's not even that dry here. So the dry cured protein film is quite brittle, and here I am showing the same film that I put on a glass just before the talk started. You can see what water does to it. Very much changes the physical properties, very high swelling, enormous drop in modulus with water. There's a lot of water in capillaries, and I call these things gels because even with a nanoindenter, they return to their original shape after deformation, which is characteristic of gels. So lots of big capillaries filled with water.
Okay, this is a Soyad.
Come on, there we go. So, how do protein gels form in food? Because the food industry has done a lot of work on how these things happen. This is a huge area of interest for the food industry. So, individual proteins, you expose them to heat, typically in water. Denaturation often results in a more hydrophobic surface. So you raise the temperature, these proteins rearrange into balls with more hydrophobic residues on the surface. They stick to each other, sometimes through disulfide, but often through hydrophobic interactions. And they continue to aggregate. Sometimes they aggregate into big balls, and sometimes they aggregate into strings. And then they get big enough that they percolate, and now you have a gel, and this is what they look like in the SEM. So these are protein gels from food processing. And so we take that idea and we say, okay, now we're going to make an adhesive, denatured or not protein aggregates. This is how they come in, in the adhesive, and then we go through the cure and create a water swollen gel. Well, actually, it's not water swollen when it's cured. It's only water swollen when you're about to do the wet test. So this is my idea of a more realistic image from the literature about, the protein adhesive when cured. You have a protein here, which is kind of like a ball, another one over here, and another one over here. And then whatever short chain crosslinker they used in this system is linking the neighboring proteins to each other and providing those interactions to carry the load from one molecule to the neighboring molecule. You can also have crosslinkers inside the protein structure, but I think that's a lot less common. And I think this is, a much better picture than those ones that I showed earlier. Okay, bond formation. Heat is really helpful for protein bond formation. Here we had 42 different soy, and I think maybe we also had some canola in here as well, but all kinds of permutations of the recipe. And for each one of these materials, 42 different materials, I blew up just a few of them so you can actually see. Material number 9, this blue line here is the Abe specimen was made and pressed for 2 minutes at 120 degrees C and then tested wet. And we got 10 or 20 newtons of shear strength, or 0.1 megapascal. But if we press for 2 minutes at 150 C, we get the red line. So it's about 1 megapascal stronger. And if we press the adhesive at 180 C, we got 2 megapascals. And this is, I show this all 40, you can blow it up and look at it on YouTube. It's a very consistent trend that higher temperature really helps with protein adhesives. Similarly, the moisture content of the adhesive also has a role. So this is the moisture content of the adhesive applied to an ABES, and then they were pressed, some of these at 120 and some at 180. But here's a particular soy protein at 85% water, 37% water, 18% water. When it's applied to the ABES and then immediately pressed, you can see that the water helped. When it went on wet, we got 3.5 megapascals. When it went on dry, we got less than 1 megapascal. So the water helps to form the bond. These are all tested wet. So hotter is better. Note that it's very well documented that protein mobility requires a higher temperature if there's less moisture present. So when we talk about the denaturation temperature of a protein, that's under the assumption that it's under saturated water conditions, very high water. If the water content goes down, the denaturation temperature goes up. And denaturation is the ability of the protein molecule to move on a large scale. It's essentially a glass transition. And water is the plasticizer that allows this polymer to go through a glass transition at a lower temperature. If you're limiting water, you need more heat to go through the glass transition, which we call denaturation in proteins. So plasticization of these polymers needs heat and water. The mobility of the protein supports physical and chemical bonding. That's where this is all leading to. If you mobilize the protein, then it can flop around. You might get some polymer entanglements. You certainly are going to get conformation in less void spaces. You're going to have the opportunity for hydrophobic residues to find each other. or whatever matching chemistry to find each other to develop a stronger network. So that mobility of the protein during bond formation is the way that you can improve the protein-to-protein interaction independent of the cross-linking agent you're using. Analogies, minimum film forming temperature in coatings. Same thing, that's related to the TG of the polymer in the coating. If you're below the TG, you don't form film. And I think you have this similar thing going on with the proteins. And re-emphasizing temperature and moisture, or whatever plasticizer you have. Could be glycerin, could be urea, could be whatever. This point about moisture enhance or facilitating the bond formation, the protein-to-protein interaction during bond formation is really critical to fiberboard and particle board applications where you are required to have very low moisture. Just the process doesn't allow the moisture. And therefore, I think this is one reason why particle board and fiberboard have seen less success in protein adhesives than especially plant-based protein adhesives than plywood has. So, knowing all this, what can we do to improve the strength? So let's look at the factors we've seen that improve the strength. So cross-linking agents, this is the backbone of commercial applications. It works. Cross-linking agents work. Heat, if you can, more is better. And moisture during bond formation improve the protein-protein interactions. I don't have as much data on the impact of moisture when cross-linking agents are present, but I know that heat does carry over when cross-linking agents are present. History. So, what is the state of the protein as it enters as it's applied to the wood? So we recently published a part of hydrophobic surfaces seem to be correlated with better wet strength, which kind of makes sense because two proteins, if they have a lot of hydrophobic interactions, then that would be a water-resistant way to transfer load between neighboring proteins. And what happens is if you have a lot of hydrophobic surfaces on the proteins and you're dispersing them in water, then you're going to end up with larger particles in the dispersion. We did a paper on jet cooking, which is when you take the protein in abundant water and inject steam. So you have a very high shear, high temperature environment. This makes very large insoluble aggregates, large as in hundreds, tens or hundreds of microns in cases. You very much change the way the proteins interact with each other. Physical structure, I think it develops interprotein bonds, aggregates them. You can create disulfides, create a lot of hydrophobic interactions between neighboring proteins to give you more structure. I lost my pointer. Hold on, there we go. There we go. Flip hydrophobic residues to the surface. As I mentioned, surface hydrophobicity is correlated with strength and seems to have some logical reason for that. I guess I don't have the data on this, but you could add water-resistant or hydrophobic materials if you can get them incorporated to the structure. That would be a way. I think it was very interesting when we were doing this hydrophobic surface. We created 16 different soy proteins so that the significant difference between all these different permutations was the way they were denatured, the pre-treatment. They were all soy proteins. When we had more amino groups on the surface, even with an amino reactive crosslinker, we had lower strength. What that tells me is that we have plenty of amino groups on the surface of many proteins to react with our cross-linking agent. Now, maybe if I had put in more cross-linking agent, I would have run out. But at least at the levels we used in the study, it seems like there wasn't any shortage of reactive amino groups to react with the cross-linking agent. But what happened, if you have more amino groups, you have less hydrophobic surface. And so since hydrophobic interactions contribute to wet strength, I think that's why we lost wet strength with more amino groups. And depolymerization is great for viscosity, but I've never seen it helpful for strength. A lot of times it's detrimental to strength if you go to high levels of depolymerization. But there you go. I think it's instructive to look at egg white, ovalbumin, even just, raw, unprocessed, not very well. You don't have, all you got to do is take the yolks out, and it makes a great adhesive. What are the properties of this great adhesive? There are about 20 kilodalton proteins that are very, very hydrophilic, very low hydrophobic character, and you can get 60% solids and it's still runny. Great viscosity properties because the proteins don't aggregate, don't interact with their neighbors. But when you put it in the press, these properties reverse. Think about the egg, what I just told you about egg white, but you put that into a frying pan and you cook it hard, that is not water soluble anymore and has some strength to it, even when wet, as you will know from trying to clean your pots and pans after cooking eggs without oil. So the protein inverts and becomes strongly hydrophobic on the surface, low solubility. It still swells, but low solubility. I do believe there's disulfides when you cook egg yolk. I can't remember at the moment. Polymer entanglement, maybe. But the wet strength of, an Abe's, the way we do it, we get about 4 megapascals, which is, commercially relevant wet strength. So what are we actually looking for? Okay, we want low viscosity, so no non-interacting small particles in solution. We want mechanical interlock, polymer entanglement. We want crosslinks. We want many and fast curing crosslinks. I don't believe there's any kind of like panel adhesive system or out there that you can count on more than 2 minutes at 100 C is the maximum you're going to get. 1 minute at 100 C or is a more realistic number for how much time and temperature you're going to get to cure your adhesive. So these crosslinks have to be fast, strongly hydrophobic, and low swelling. So cross-linking among proteins. How can we get the proteins to cross-link? Disulfides likely occur. I'm not sure if other covalent bonds are significant or not. I really question whether the conditions that occur in a commercial press are enough to drive any other kind of covalent bonding. We would love to have DOPA, like the underwater mussel, like the mussels use to glue themselves to rocks underwater. That'd be great, but this is a very unstable structure. Love to have aldehydes on the protein. They would probably react in the press. Love to have chelation. Maillard reactions are very commonly mentioned in the literature and used as an explanation for why you develop strength. And I want to point out that Maillard starts with a cross-linking reaction here, but it quickly progresses to cleavage. And so I am not convinced that it's actually relevant for protein adhesives because this is really a transient state. And if you get a lot of Maillard, you probably have a lot of it going beyond into the cleavage state, so it's not helpful anymore. I just wanted to point out there is a way to kind of address these questions of what's going on, and that would be to soak the cured adhesive, like your bond line, like your Abe specimen, in a solvent that targets a specific bond. So water targets polar interactions, and so we test wet all the time. So here's the wet strength of PRF, ovalbumin, and soy isolate that was jet cooked and soy isolate that wasn't. Then we took more of these samples dry, put them in water plus SMBS, which breaks disulfide bonds. That didn't affect PRF, but it did affect ovalbumin and the soys. Then we took samples and soaked them in water plus 6 molar urea. Urea and thiourea impact hydrophobic associations, make them weaker. And so you can see the impact on the strength. Urea reduces the strength because those hydrophobic interactions are contributing. And then you can mix the two. So here's just a way to probe the adhesives. And if anybody has ideas for other solvents you can use to probe other reactions, I'd love to hear from you, or other covalent bonds. I'd love to hear from you. I mentioned earlier that it's understood that prior denaturation treatment is generally helpful. So why do denatured proteins often perform better? Here's some ideas. Denaturation often increases surface hydrophobicity, so those sticky balls stick to each other better in water. Maybe cleavage of the protein increases mobility. I don't know. Okay, generate the hydrophobic associations, basically building the network during the denaturation treatment and then applying that pre-aggregated protein to the adhesive or to the wood, and then bond formation doesn't destroy it. So you can develop polymer entanglements, disulfide bonds, hydrophobic associations that persist in the final film. Here's a big thing to look for in the literature. This is such a common statement. We denatured to expose reactive groups. This is very commonly stated and very rarely elaborated on, and even less commonly supported by any kind of data. What do you mean by reactive groups? Do you mean hydrophobic surfaces that are going to stick to each other? Do you mean amino groups that are going to chemically react potentially? And it is extremely rare that anyone ever supports this statement with data. And I find it very disheartening because if you're going to make that statement, I implore you to support it and actually clarify what you mean. What do you mean by reactive groups, and why do you think that that actually happened? All right, possible ways to improve performance. Just want to point out, here's flour, native state flour, 50% protein. Here's commercial isolate. This is barely holds together. This is like 3 megapascals, 2.5, 3 wet strength. We added the carbohydrate to the isolate. We removed the carbohydrate from the flour, and there's still a big gap in the wet strength. So protein content has a role, but the state can be a useful driver of strength. So we took the native isolate, jet cooked it, got the commercial values. Commercial isolates had been jet cooked. We wet autoclaved them. We lost a lot of strength. There's something significant in the state of the protein. What's interesting about this is that this boost in performance persists in the presence of cross-linking agents. That's not normal. A lot of the things you do to boost the performance of a protein get washed out when you start adding enough cross-linking agent to get to commercial strength. But this is one thing that does not. So protein state can be a useful way to develop strength. Maybe developing beta sheets. Beta sheets are strongly associated with good wet strength in materials. Make the soy flip to hydrophobic in the press. So ovalbumin does that great. Can we figure out how to make the other proteins we work with have such a drastic change? Or can you go through your library of available proteins and look for something that has really dramatic increase in hydrophobicity with denaturation? Extensive cross-linking. This is what is used commercially. Can we build it into the protein? Can we prime them? Can we prime the proteins to have lots of SH groups so that they make disulfides? Can we put some reactive group on the surface of the protein? Can we oxidize the insoluble carbohydrates to a reactive state, like pyruvate, but cost effective, to create polyaldehydes or some other reactive chemistry? Just mentioning that there's a lot of insoluble carbohydrates in most of these flours because, the maximum is 50% protein. Well, okay, 60 anyway. We could add cross-linkers. This is the standard in the industry. Maybe polyaldehydes have a role. Formaldehyde is the fastest reacting aldehyde, but if you put in a polyaldehyde, you might be able to overcome that by numbers. Tannins, they're reactive, so they, improve cross-linking. And don't forget, there's all this carbohydrate in the matrix. Include that in the adhesive. It's not just protein. In reality, your flour has a lot of carbohydrates in it. Potentially incorporating non-swelling hydrophobic material into the protein, get it into the protein structure. Zane from corn is a very hydrophobic protein, and you can get corn zane fairly cheap from cornstarch production. The residue is high in protein, and so it has about half the protein is zane. There's the magnesium oxide system patented by Kai-Sheng Li, and that's used commercially limited. But so, do you have here an inorganic matrix intertwined with the organic matrix? Or does it just simply slow the ingress of water, or is it simply a chelation? But that's a possibility. Polyurethane and nacre, you have soft and hard domains. Could that be used to improve protein? And so, just about right on time. Protein adhesives are gels. They're aggregates of rice-like balls. So, because the cured adhesive is aggregates of balls, that means we have limited interaction between a protein and its neighbor. The protein mobility and interactions are limited by how much water and heat is available. We suspect there's limited covalent reactions between the proteins. As far as anything other than disulfide bonds, I don't think there's much of that happening between proteins unless you add a cross-linking agent. And we suspect there's very limited protein entanglement between neighboring proteins. If you can get polymer entanglement, that's a great way to develop strength. We need to increase the gel toughness. Typically, this is done with cross-linking agents. Here's some other ways that maybe the gel strength can be increased. Surface hydrophobicity, beta sheets, surface reactive groups. And you can increase protein interactions with their neighbor in some processing step before applying it to the wood, such as jet cooking. However, I have always seen, and it makes logical sense to me, that if you build structure and you build these larger protein complexes before you apply them to the wood, you pay the price in viscosity. So the more hydrophobic surfaces and the bigger the particles, the higher the viscosity. And that's a challenge, to be sure. And we want to reduce water sensitivity. Some ideas are moisture barriers. Can you put something in there that's kind of a wall that doesn't let the water through, or lower the hydrophobicity overall? And with that, I'd like to thank all the hard work, the funding, you for your attention, all the partners and the people who have contributed intellectually to this. And here's a picture of a bunch of the people at FPL working on soy adhesives. And with that, I will open the floor for questions.
We have some time for questions because then we have a closed session that we need to move to another session for the BioGlue. But if there are some short questions that...
Yes, I guess I have a questions, if that's okay.
Yes, Marjan.
Thanks, Chris, for a very nice presentation. I never worked with protein and learned a lot. My quick questions is related to using apes for the wet strains. How does it correlate to wet strain tests that boil waters with the plywood associations that they recommend?
So what we found, so one thing that makes me feel good about the ABES with protein adhesives is that both the ABES wet test and the plywood wet test fail cohesively, primarily. And so you have a similar failure condition in both, which gives me some comfort. Also, if you don't get 3 megapascals and a 5 millimeter overlap in the ABES, don't even bother making plywood. You'll never pass the North American standard. And so, if you have 4.5 megapascals, then, definitely want to make plywood and see how you do in the North American standards for wet strength. The European, making 1 megapascal consistently day in and day out is challenging to do that cost effectively. Certainly can be done. You can make particle board, fiber board, all these things if you want to increase the amount of cross-linker and increase your cost. But anyway, we're pretty happy with it as a screening test. The great thing about ABES is that it's fast. You can get data fast and see if you made a big difference or not.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you, Chris. What I'm curious about in your introduction, you also say that plywood has been made in America historically with protein adhesives. Do you have some access or inspiration from these ancient recipes, or are they lost in history?
No, they are not lost in history. They are available if you dig deep enough. And if you are interested, you can contact me or Chuck. Chuck knows better than I do that literature. But basically, very high pH. They put in silica. They put in calcium hydroxide. A lot of things that you would think of as chelating agents. Added blood. Because blood is in general a better wood adhesive than soy is. That's kind of how the direction of those things go. Very high viscosity, short pot life because of depolymerization of the protein, and not very good wet strength, which is one of the reasons, kind of moderate wet strength, one of the reasons they went to UF. But also UF is just so easy to work with relative to the proteins, especially those protein systems that they had. But yeah, there is literature out there if you read the books from the 60s.
Thank you.
We thank everybody that was here today. And we're looking forward to see you in the next webinar.